private Swiftclaw scaled talons was beginning to truly despise forests. They wreaked havoc on the Avari corpsman's sight. All the blasted vegetation appeared to end just above his eye level, and presented a constant series of obstacles for him to avoid. He'd nearly crashed 3 times since getting his assignment. Duck beneath the partially decayed log, veer to the side to evade colliding with the boulder jutting out just past it, scramble up and over the rocky ledge behind that, keep low to the ground, attempt to avoid getting tagged, and keep moving. Cassavac could bleed out while you paused to breathe. His meager gear allotment wasn't helping either. Just camo, some light-armored plates, and an unsealed helmet to accompany his standard-issue 2/3 pulse rifle, sidearm, and pack. No stims, exoskeleton-enhanced strength, or accelerated movement. Flaring really longed for his full battle dress. His helmet emitted a faint warning beep, and he flung himself down, sheltering beneath his wings. Their fabric covering was disguised, and Flaring disappeared into the undergrowth. The drone that hummed over his location failed to detect him. He continued his run the moment the all-clear signal was given. There were still 3 clicks remaining. Leap over a small rock, slip swiftly between 2 trees, spring slightly higher than necessary to clear a patch of thorns. It was just like the obstacle course back at Peak Zephyr. He'd completed that 100 times. He could handle it once more now. 2 of Flaring's forelegs snagged on a concealed root as he touched down. He tumbled head over heels before his chest crashed into the earth. He'd been moving swiftly, and it was painful. Dark spots encroached on his sight. Who was he fooling? Flaring was well aware he wasn't a soldier. In the exiled swarm, barely 1% of Avari had passed the pre-screening for their combat training. Among those who did, another 80% dropped out within the first week. His species simply wasn't built for combat. Avari lacked the necessary strength, speed, or even courage. By the time they mustered the will to stand their ground, it was typically too late to make a difference. He ought to have never allowed those blasted humans to persuade him to attempt the test once more. He hadn't been the only one. It appeared as if half the flock was competing for sought-after frontline positions. Flaring could still recall the first time he'd learned of the Solar Federation. He'd just completed his rounds in the cramped, overcrowded infirmary aboard the EFS Brighter Tomorrow, tirelessly combating the illness and disease caused by severe overcrowding, when the message beacon transmitted alongside the EFS Unvanquished arrived. Hundreds of vessels went quiet as the battle song started to play. Flaring hadn't, naturally. He'd loathed the concept of the so-called vanguard ships, of squandering precious vessels and soldiers on an endless succession of doomed last stands. And they were invariably last stands. The dirge commenced, the Avari ship fired, and then the transmission ended. The hegemony ensured the exiled swarm was outmatched. However, this time, the recording didn't stop. It continued on. After several minutes spent anticipating the conclusion of the battle song, Flaring approached a wall console nearby and activated the video recording. There must have been something unique about this particular fight. He had simply stood there, paralyzed with shock, as he observed the humans unleash missile after missile into one of the biggest hegemony fleets he'd ever witnessed. A cluster of cruisers encircled the BCS battering ram, a massive super dreadnought. The smaller Krell ships had shattered like fragile eggs under the onslaught, but the imposing ram had continued its advance. Then the footage had switched to a human Marine's gun camera. Human Marines had infiltrated the hegemony flagship. The Krell and Vexar aboard the ship had mounted a fierce and desperate defense, yet the Terran boarders refused to yield. Avari, small, weak, frightened Avari, had rushed into battle alongside their human allies, drawing fire and creating chaos behind enemy barricades, while human sharpshooters picked off targets with cold precision. Avari had leapt towards grenades to throw them back at hegemony troops. Avari had moved behind the Terran lines, sealing breaches before even the humans could respond. Most of the Avari perished naturally, but each one took dozens of the despised Krell with them. Every life lost had been more than compensated for. The applause when the Terrans had at last seized the Ram's bridge had been ear-splitting. The following day, more Avari cleared the pre-screening than in the previous 5 years put together. Flaring was among them. The exiled swarm could always benefit from combat medics. With a soft groan, Flaring pushed himself up off the ground. He had come too far to allow himself to be sidelined by a tree root. He began to run, slide between those two clumps of ferns, cross through a narrow creek, weave around an enormous tree, disregard the pain in his sides, pay no mind to his quivering muscles. Simply immerse yourself in the pursuit. His case-vac lay sprawled face down on the ground, pack and rear armor torn by a pulsar dart. A swift scan confirmed that the human was still alive, if barely, and would remain so if the Avari acted quickly. Flaring wasted a few moments staring at his quivering, grasping hands, attempting to get them under control, but innumerable hours of drills took over. The battle dressing was applied cleanly. Artillery fire, he wasn't sure if it was friendly or hostile, landed close by. Flaring attempted to pull the much larger human further into the underbrush, but the tired Avari could barely lift the human's arm. He would have traded a wing for his powered armor right now. With it, he could have hoisted the damn mammal onto his back and carried him back to the field hospital. Without it, he'd need to improvise. He hunched down over the human, a sergeant based on the rank insignia, and shielded them both with his wings. Perhaps he could mislead the enemy spotter. A shell struck less than 10 meters to his left, pelting him with soil and small shrapnel. Flaring suppressed the impulse to flee. He had no intention of departing. Time seemed to slow as the Avari corpsman shielded the sergeant. 4 additional shells landed nearby, each creeping closer to the cowering avian and unconscious human, before the follow-up medical unit finally arrived. One of the anticipated 5 humans was absent, and 2 of them displayed pulsar burns on their armor. They appeared to have drawn more attention than Flaring. A pair of humans assumed watch duty, while the Avari silently moved to his designated security post. He braced his rifle against an especially large root and surveyed the undergrowth. His breathing was too rapid, his triple-valved heart racing. How did those cursed humans remain so infuriatingly calm? Not one of their weapons even trembled, while his jittered about like a hatchling's eager beak. 3 minutes later, the 4 Terrans were heading back towards the field hospital, their case-vac secured firmly onto a small anti-grav stretcher. He hadn't regained consciousness, but he was no longer in immediate danger. Well, medical danger, at least. They could all still get hit by an arty round, or shot down by a barrage of pulsar darts, or trigger one of those damned landmines. They returned to the field hospital after encountering only 2 short firefights, both from a great distance. Neither side had managed to hit their targets, but the enemy's shots had also missed. Flaring could scarcely find fault with those circumstances. The field hospital, essentially an enlarged jump ship stationed beside the command tent, was teeming with corpsmen, injured personnel, and officers. The latter were attempting to assemble makeshift squads from anyone they believed capable of wielding a rifle, and their numbers had noticeably increased since Flaring's departure from the field hospital. The offensive apparently wasn't progressing as smoothly as hoped. An Avari officer signaled for him to stop. Flaring offered a weary salute, then tensed as he noticed the vivid yellow feathers. First Lieutenant Silverbeak Gliding Wings, a veteran of the Battle of Saul, the sole Avari officer not selected from among the flocklords, Chirp himself. The officer appeared as though some massive beast had snatched him up, gnawed on him briefly, then determined he wasn't to its liking. Yet the small, bird-like man still glided through the throng with effortless confidence. He reciprocated Flaring's salute, then peered down at the corpsman's rank insignia and medic badge. "Up for a run, Private? My squad could use a corpsman." Flaring wasn't. He hadn't experienced such fatigue since the initial days of basic training, and he was aware that respite awaited just within the tent. He'd have a moment to regain his breath, tend to his injuries, and gather himself before venturing out again. The Avari parted his lips to reply, then unexpectedly caught himself off guard. "Yes, sir. Where are we mustering, and when do we leave?" Chirp's feathers ruffled with amusement. "Hold on now. I still need to get approval from your squad leader. There's an assembly of Avari just to the south of the command tent. You can't miss it. Wait there while I take care of the formalities." Flaring set off at a gentle run, berating himself as he went. Who could guess what the sole Avari Special Forces officer might be scheming? He was classified as an infantryman, certainly, but that didn't mean he was especially keen on receiving a pulsar dart to the chest. He spotted the small flock without much trouble. 20-some Avari were conspicuous amidst the ocean of tall, two-legged beings. There weren't any humans mingled with the group either. This had to be one of those specialized strikes he'd been hearing about during briefings. Lieutenant Chirp showed up a few moments after, with a human officer following close behind. Another decorated veteran, that one. Captain Hawkins. He was wheeling a cart loaded with shrink-wrapped equipment. "You won't believe what tumbled off the back of an R&D truck," Jenkins remarked. "They're absolutely fantastic." 30 Avari slipped through the debris, taking pains to move quietly. They neared the fortified hill from one of the more difficult sides, utilizing the broken terrain to their benefit. The diminutive avians could slide through fissures in the earth that would have left one of the considerably larger humans vulnerable. Not one of them would have gotten within half a kilometer of the enemy position without their new equipment. Flaring had no idea where Jenkins and Chirp had obtained the stealth kits from. As far as he knew, the gear they were using hadn't even finished the final stages of R&D, let alone become available for acquisition. But he was grateful. It felt great to be almost invisible. A gray-green ghillie suit, its fibers interwoven with an array of masking devices and light-bending threads, concealed him from any observers watching their approach. His standard-issue pulse rifle was now accompanied by a lightweight, silenced railgun, the compact carbine capable of firing thousands of rounds a second with hardly a sound, and his subpar half-helmet had been swapped for a sealed bucket complete with HUD and tight-beam comms. No more creeping around with bated breath. He was equipped with proper gear now. The initial rank arrived at the outer perimeter and began cutting through the barbed wire. It was slow, painstaking work. Each wire carried sufficient current to fry a tank, let alone an Avari, and one had to maintain the circuit unbroken while carving a path through. Then it was necessary to carefully peel back the obstacle before proceeding to the next strand, moving methodically to avoid contact with other strands. Creating an explosion would have merely alerted the defenders. It was preferable to use a stealthy approach. It took almost 30 minutes to create a path for the makeshift platoon. They traversed the exposed area past the barbed wire at an agonizingly slow pace, relying on their camouflage to conceal them from the automated defense turrets. They couldn't spot the human guards beyond the barriers, but the LT assured the other Avari they were present. Something about subtle acoustic signals. It seemed plausible enough. The 30 Avari arrived at the sandbags and poured over like a noiseless tidal wave. Flaring discharged a burst of subsonic slugs at the first armored biped, felling him before he could shout, then aimed at another as it lifted a rifle. It moved quicker than the Avari. Flaring winced in expectation of the pulsar darts as the defender's finger tightened around the trigger. Lieutenant Chirp cannonballed into the defender's weapon, dislodging it from the biped's grip as the Avari officer thrust his railgun against its faceplate and discharged. A spray of dark blood misted out. Chirp faced Flaring, his expression resolute. "Don't confront them directly. They'll overpower us. Take them by surprise instead. We're far more nimble." Flaring nodded silently, merely watching as the lieutenant jogged away down a hallway. He glanced at his HUD, finding to his surprise that he had the identical objective, then trailed after. The remaining Avari divided into groups of 4 or 5 and hurried off in pursuit of their own assigned targets. They glided like specters through the hallways, directed by yet another of Jenkins and Chirp's surprises, an AI program capable of predicting the defenders' response patterns and internal defenses with unsettling accuracy. They emitted EMPs, fired at hostiles, and maneuvered around corners with human-like precision. They were spotted only once by an armored soldier leaving a bathroom, but they peppered him with slugs before he could even react. Their goal was the central command and control room for the building's anti-air defenses. Other teams were targeting crucial secondary objectives, artillery control, communication centers, and anti-plants, but theirs was the most critical. 5 Avari, including Chirp and Flaring, lined up outside the door as a 6th set a breaching charge. It had required all of them to move the bodies of the door guards out of the way. There hadn't been anything like a pre-Terran Avari door breach tactic. In fact, there hadn't been much pre-Terran military strategy at all. Of course, they could all withstand a volley of pulsar darts and shoot back, but that was pretty much it. They lacked a military tradition to rely on, and none of the hegemony were keen on training a fleet of escaped slaves. The humans had altered that. As the door burst open, the 6 Avari rushed into the room with intent and accuracy, pulse rifles firing darts. A good 2/3 of the return fire was a foot too high, ideal center mass shots that would have incapacitated a human combatant. The defenders who managed to adjust their aim struggled to follow the Avari dispersing across the room, or stop shooting as a volley of pulse darts struck them in the torso. It was finished in moments. 9 bipeds were strewn across the room, their discarded weapons nearby. 3 Avari had sustained injuries. One was so badly damaged that Flaring couldn't even obtain vital signs from his equipment, and another had received a pulsar dart to the face. Chirp was the third, though the Avari remained standing. One of his wings drooped, its nerves paralyzed by a glancing dart hit. The lieutenant seemed unconcerned. Flaring scarcely had time to secure the officer's wing before they pressed on, dismissing the corpsman's objections. Lingering too long in one place might prove fatal. They had traveled barely 100 meters when the AI guide's monotone voice alerted them that they were about to encounter a squad of defenders. Flaring looked around desperately as the other Avari stopped. He couldn't spot any place on the ground where they might conceal themselves. The defenders had done an excellent job transforming the old deserted concrete bunkers into a contemporary military facility. The hallways were stark and brightly lit, lacking any suitable hiding spots where the Avari might take cover, and their active camouflage wasn't sufficient to blend with bare stone. If they found themselves caught in the open, the situation would turn ugly. Chirp scarcely hesitated before dashing up the wall, his 4 limbs and single remaining wing driving him towards a tangle of pipes and wires fastened to the lofty ceiling. The other members of the squad, Flaring among them, propelled themselves in pursuit. Their tight-beam communications fell silent as they lingered amidst the corroded metal. 7 bipeds turned the corner, advancing with icy efficiency. Their weapons scanned the hallway as they moved forward. Not one of them glanced upward. Flaring gripped his pipe with his 4 legs as he steadied his railgun against a shoulder. His hands were trembling again. Chirp's weren't. The Avari officer hardly moved as he peered down his weapon, designating targets with tiny, almost imperceptible flicks of his wingtip. Something within Flaring's helmet had malfunctioned. His deep breaths were starting to fog the visor. Chirp's wingtips slashed downwards. Flaring sensed his weapon recoil against his shoulder once, twice, and then a third time. Both his targets fell. They moved silently through the hallways until they reached a rooftop landing area. The remaining Avari who had survived their various missions were gathering there, and 2 teams had already secured the platform and begun setting up some of the few heavy weapons they'd brought into the facility. With a little luck, they wouldn't need to use them before the main attack force arrived, but the Avari would be prepared regardless. Flaring's limbs were trembling with fatigue as he sought shelter behind the broken remains of a drone. Jenkins and his team needed to show up soon. 7 tense minutes ticked by in silence. Then he caught the sound of the dropships. 3 sleek Terran behemoths touched down on the sea's landing pad, unloading human troops. They assumed a defensive formation that allowed the Avari to ease up. Well, nearly all of the Avari. Chirp had drifted back to the vessels, where Captain Hawkins was gesticulating angrily as he argued with someone unseen and unheard. Several harsh words were audible over the soft tread of human boots and shifting armor. Flaring was nearly done treating one of the more severely injured Avari when the wargame suddenly concluded. The mangled grasping arm he was wrapping unexpectedly became intact, his patient recoiling as the artificially deadened limb twitched to life. The forms of the defenders transformed from shadowy aliens to battered humans, then began to move as their immobility faded. Flaring's pulse rifle and railgun altered as well, vivid orange plugs materializing in their barrels. Even the atmosphere seemed to become fresher. Captain Hawkins released a victorious cheer. The other humans followed suit. Flaring abruptly felt out of his element. It had been different during the simulation, but now he wasn't caught up in the adrenaline of combat. Now he was acutely aware of just how unqualified he was. Every man Jenkins had brought had handled weapons practically since birth, then passed the rigorous Special Forces selection process. Flaring had only picked up his first weapon 13 months ago. He was woefully outmatched. That didn't prevent the humans from patting him on the back and praising him, though. He quickly lost count of the sheer number of men and women who crouched down beside him to express gratitude for rushing out to help a comrade or for donning a ghillie suit and making his way into the base. Chief Warrant Officer Blackburn even proposed flaring a position in one of the new Special Forces units the Admiralty was establishing. How did you respond to that? Chirp walked up to flaring the moment the warrant officer turned away. Are you going to accept that offer? Probably not, sir. There's no way I'd pass the selection. From the way the men are carrying on about our infiltration, I doubt you'll have much say in the matter. Jenkins is practically salivating, though he still appears let down that we weren't able to utilize the air vents. Vents, sir? No need to be concerned, Private. It's merely a reference from an old film he had me watch. He's been entertaining this fantasy for some time now. A furious individual clad in an officer's dress uniform burst out onto the deck, heading directly for Jenkins. Chirp let out a sigh. I should head over to the captain before he lashes out at that general. Chirp started to leave, then hesitated. Think about Gary's proposal. He believes you're up for it, and I concur. You won't find a better opportunity to strike back at the hegemony. Flaring observed Chirp's departure, noting the respect the gathered humans displayed toward the Avari. He experienced an unexpected sense of satisfaction as he pondered CWO Geary's proposal. This day hadn't been all that terrible. Perhaps he could adapt to military life after all.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.